And we're back. Episode 5. Hyde Park, Barracks, Sydney, Australia. We left off with a view of the dormitory. This has been recreated for the purposes of exhibition and for penal tourism. And this is where visitors engage in their own little performance, pretending to be a convict and their imagination of what it might be, and having some fun along the way. And, you know, I mentioned last time in the previous episode that, references to summer camp ought to really be called out when examining conditions of confinement. What I mentioned last episode was that the Trump administration in 2019, in the outrage over the separation of families at the border and the caging of kids and these really outrages upon personal dignity, was dismissed by the Trump administration in a press conference as, well, it's just like summer camp. Folks, this is not summer camp. Being a convict, having been transported from England or from Ireland, where you were doubly damned, being sentenced by British courts in your homeland of Ireland, to wind up down under, subjected to hard labor, finally get a chance to sleep, and here are the hammocks. Now, let me refer to one of the really amazing, epic narratives on Australia by Robert Hughes, The Fatal Shore. And he referred to transportation as a Noah's Ark of small-time criminality. And he also devotes an entire chapter to another episode, to the story of transportation. Let me backtrack just one frame. This is a peephole that was carved into the wall by the guards, who from time to time would peer into this opening at night to see whether the convicts were behaving themselves. Because you can imagine this dormitory with upwards of 60 convicts. You had young, old, you had teenagers, and once the lights went out, you could just imagine the abuse unfolding. Sexual assault. Robert Hughes in his book devotes a chapter to the problem of venereal disease that was being spread among the convicts, to which one bishop said famously, this was the wrath of God. Pollution. In my previous videos and lectures and episodes, I talk at length about the sociological implication of pollution, the threat and anxiety of the profane expressed in pollution. So here we have an opportunity to once again re-examine pollution, threat, danger. So once we get back to this image, now you have deeper knowledge, a thicker description of what this particular space might have inhabited. Just not the convicts, but a venue, a source where pollution is perpetrated. Let us continue. This is a reminder, as I mentioned in the previous episode, transportation to Australia was not this free-for-all where the governor and the Navy and the warders could kind of improvise things as they went along. On the contrary, this is a reminder that these institutions, the Sydney Barracks and other penal sites, were following rules. Superintendents, subordinate officers, the establishment of convicts. These are the instructions. Order. Order is a very important element of incarceration. I refer to it as the dream of order. In the popular imagination, how should a place of confinement be operated? If you're trying to instill a sense of discipline and order on those being confined there, the larger enterprise must itself be governed according to an established set of rules. Recall in the previous episode, I made reference to the magistrates who were assigned at the courthouse on the premises of the Sydney Barracks, who could listen and review complaints from convicts who felt that they had a legitimate grievance against an officer, a guard, the governor. So this is just a reminder of the rule book. Rules are important when we govern prisons. And this is just a reminder that the British was actually, they were conforming to these rules. I'm going to backtrack just one more time. Go back to this unsettling reminder of the dormitory. While these events are unfolding in places like Sydney, there are parallel events taking place in London, where members of Parliament and members of the royal family and well-educated scholars who are tracking this phenomenon of transportation begin to worry whether this, on its face, whether this looks good, of shipping predominantly all-male transportation ships. There were whispers in Victorian society that maybe they were perpetuating a society of perverts. And I mention that because Robert Hughes examines this particular plot line in transportation as a precursor to consider the pathway by which women were then becoming transported from England and especially Ireland to Tasmania. The majority of women who were transported to Tasmania, as the historical record clearly indicates, were Irish women who were also of childbearing years. So that's one of the points of consideration as to how Victorian society was coping with this impending crisis of perception that only men were being shipped, and then what on earth are they doing to each other in Australia? Robert Hughes, A Fatal Shore. Let's move on. This gives us an idea of the interior of the Sydney Barracks. Streamlined, neat, sober, clean, preserved for the purposes of penal tourism. Let's move on. Who do you think you are? See if I can magnify this so you can read it with me. Who do you think you are? Robert Hughes, in his book, as well as other sources of historical reflection and historical re-examination of Australia, prompted a shift in Australian culture in the 1970s. And this placard points to this shift in cultural consciousness. Long after the convict era ended, the stigma attached to having a convict ancestry remained. The stain of the convict heritage was something to be hidden rather than celebrated. Whole branches dropped from family trees when they were found to contain a convict. And the 1970s were a turning point with changing social values and a new openness to understanding our past. More liberal perspectives emerged with the women's and Aboriginal rights movement. Historians began to consider the lives and experience of ordinary people, working classes, women, migrants, Aboriginal people, children, even convicts, who had previously been overlooked by history. Yet modern Australian society, early industries, agriculture were founded largely by convicts. Today, finding a convict in the roots of one's family tree has become a badge of honor. The groundswell of interest in researching family origins is reinforced by television programs, online family history resources, and it is estimated that 1 in 10 Australians has a convict ancestry. Let's pause and return to this fascinating shift in cultural dynamics.